I was 65 when the house went quiet in a way I couldn't fix with radios or ball games or the clatter of pots, a hush that felt like a curtain dropped across the stage after the actors had already slipped off through the wings. Margaret had her hip replaced in March and our two-story in Canatillo turned into a one-story life, everything brought downstairs for her, the pill sorter, the chipped blue teapot, the stack of church newsletters she swore she'd catch up on. I moved like a caretaker who knew the routes but not the language. Laundry down, meals up. Check the ice packs, lift the leg. Count the hours between pain meds, and still the room stayed heavy. As if even the dust didn't want to float. On a Tuesday I called my neighbor Ruth, who seemed to have a phone tree for every crisis. And on Wednesday a woman arrived with a mop bucket, a bottle of lemon cleaner, and a careful smile that didn't seem forced so much as practiced for safety. "Iveless," she said, the syllables like coins tapped on a counter, then, softer. "Everyone calls me Ivy." The name brightened the kitchen in a way the overhead light never did. She wore sneakers with flattened soles and carried herself like someone accustomed to not taking up space. The gray t-shirt was knotted at her hip, the knot holding a little tail of fabric the way a child might clutch a blanket. I told her where the rags were, where I kept the good towels, the bad towels. The old towels that Margaret insisted were for the dog we never had. Ivy slid into the rhythm of the house in under an hour. She hummed under her breath, something with a sway to it, like a lullaby that remembered dancing, while she ran the rag along the baseboards. When she spoke, her voice carried the borderlands. Not just Spanish smoothed into English but the stretches between. The pauses that said the words were choosing their order carefully. She told me she had a son in El Paso, 12, liked drawing cars, hated gym class. Wanted a pair of shoes that lit up when you stepped but they were too baby for him now. She did not tell me about anyone else. Which is how I began to fill in the blank spaces with my own pencil, shading lightly at first. Margaret asked, from the couch, without looking up from The Price is Right, if the new girl had remembered to switch the sheets to cotton because the flannel made her itch. The new girl. I felt an odd guilt for the way those two words touched in the air. As if they were hands that shouldn't meet. She remembered, I said, though I had not told Ivy about the sheets. When I went upstairs at noon to set out Margaret's pills, Ivy was in the laundry room, flattening a shirt of mine on the counter with 4 fingers fanned, patting it as if to reassure it that it would do no more shrinking. Shirts don't need comfort, but I stood there anyway and watched her smooth the fabric. A motion so efficient it felt like kindness. She didn't startle when I cleared my throat. She kept her hand where it was, palm wide over my last name stitched on a dry cleaner's tag. Inside the collar. Calder, she said, the sound curious rather than covetous. Like a tourist trying out the pronunciation of a street. She said it again. The second time it hit my ribs the way a name does the first time you hear it said by someone who seems to see the person it belongs to. I should have turned that into a joke, something Scottish, my grandfather. A fisherman who never saw the sea, but I asked her why. And that was the choice that loosened something I'd been tying tight for 42 years. Because it fits, she said, and if there was a smile in her mouth it didn't reach her eyes. Her hands kept working. A good worker's hands, my father would have said. No rings, a thin pale line where a ring had been. The laundry room smelled like hot cotton, lemon cleaner, and the faint sweetness of the coconut oil in her hair that I would pretend not to notice. Later. In that moment I wanted to be the sort of man who said what a good name could afford. Someone like her, the doors it might open, the trouble it might invite. I wanted to be the sort of man who left the room. Instead, I stood there and let the electricity of being regarded hum at the base of my skull. A current I hadn't felt since I was young enough to mistake attention for destiny. That night Margaret shifted in bed and hissed when her hip caught. The sound made me wince like I'd been struck with a ruler across the fingers. I lay on my back and watched the ceiling fan turn, counting how many passes it took before the shadow of it made the corner lamp flicker. Sometime in that slow spin, I heard Ivy say my name again, as if the house had learned to repeat her voice back to me. There are men who will claim a woman made them do what they did. Those men are liars. I wanted the wanting. The next week we settled into a schedule that pretended to be accidental. Ivy came Mondays and Thursdays. On those days I found reasons to come home early from the office I still kept at the firm, even though all the work could be done by email. I brought her coffee in a mug that Margaret didn't like, too heavy, too blue, and Ivy drank it in 3 careful swallows between tasks, never standing still with a cup in her hand, always moving as if the floor were timed. She teased me about leaving change in my pockets, and I teased her about hiding bills in her shoe, and she laughed and said, if I hid money it would be where you old men never look. And I wanted, badly, to ask where that was. Not for the location but for the permission that question might imply. On a Thursday I came in and found her standing in the library with her palm pressed to the glass of a framed black and white portrait of my grandfather. Not the fisherman I had conjured in my fake story, but a tailor in Lubbock who stitched suits sturdy enough to withstand dust storms and luck. This the man? She asked without turning her head. The photograph showed him in a vest, needle between teeth, eyes not smiling but not stern. The look of a person measuring ideas against cloth. That's him, I said. He sewed every man in our county into something that made them stand straighter. Ivy smiled at the glass. Names are suits you wear, no? She turned then, eyebrows lifted, demanding an answer like a teacher who refuses to grade a blank page. Sometimes they're hand-me-downs, I said. Sometimes they're the only clothes that ever fit. We looked at each other and I felt a slow, unsmart heat crawl into my face. She broke it by pointing at the shelves and asking if I had any books in Spanish. Because her son needed to practice and the library at his school was full of ripped covers and missing pages. I told her to take what she wanted. She ran a finger along the spines as if reading them by touch. And I envied the books for being handled with that care. When she left that day she slipped 2 paperbacks into her bag without the false apology people perform to make theft into charity. I thought, she takes cleanly. That ought to have scared me. It did not. I convinced myself I was kind. Kindness was safer than desire, and I wore it like a reflective vest. Kindness drove her home when the bus ran late and the sky over the Franklin Mountains turned the color of bruised peaches. Kindness stopped at Food City and bought her boy the light-up shoes even though she'd said he'd aged out of them, and I'd nodded like a wise man. Kindness saw her lift Margaret's glass of water without being asked and angle the straw just so, her hand on the rim, a steadying that made my wife, for that moment, softer. In the front seat of my Toyota, driving along Mesa Street, Ivy told me a story about her own father. How he had once scolded her for borrowing his last name on a school form she filled out for a raffle. How he said a name was something a man gave and could take away. How she had decided then that men were licensing offices in shirts. She laughed when she said it, but the laugh had a splinter in it. My boy uses my name, she said, looking out the window. He says it is strong enough. Maybe he is wrong, but I like how he says it. It is strong, I said, and when she glanced at me I held the look a beat too long. Enough to make a new channel for the current we'd been avoiding. The thing you must understand, not to excuse, only to map, is that the first small trespass felt not like breaking and entering but like being waved past a gate by a guard who had already been bribed. On a Monday the doorbell rang while Ivy was scrubbing the sink and I was pretending to adjust the settings on the air purifier. And she dried her hands on her knotted t-shirt and went to the door before I did. I heard her voice say my last name to the delivery man, quick, competent. And when he asked for a signature she took the pen and, without looking back at me, signed my name in a tilt that looked nothing like mine and yet in that instant might as well have been written with my blood. The package was a set of paperback thrillers I'd ordered at midnight. Stacked plots about men who were wronged and men who were righteous and not much difference between the two. She put the box on the counter and her gaze slid to mine and stayed there. A dare, a question, a plea, I couldn't tell. I should have said, "You can't do that," and maybe laughed to soften it. A little mock scolding to put the fence back where it belonged. Instead I said nothing and the silence itself was permission. That afternoon Margaret asked if Ivy could come on Saturdays instead sometimes. Because the church ladies were visiting on Thursdays now and she didn't want the help around when there was company, and I heard the flinch in Ivy's breathing from the kitchen even though she didn't make a sound. I said Thursdays worked best. Later, when I carried a tray with soup and crackers and the small bell Margaret rang when she wanted me, she told me I looked guilty. "What did you do?" she asked, half laughing, and I thought of the package, the pen, the tilt of the forgery. The way my name quivered in my mind like a thing caught on the hook of someone else's need. "I bought books," I said. "More men being chased for reasons. You and your stories," she said, rolling her eyes toward the ceiling. And something in me felt challenged by the way she dismissed those paper men. The next Thursday I came home earlier than I needed to. I found Ivy in the library again, not touching the portrait this time, but measuring with her hands the space above the mantel. "Too big for a TV," she said, and when I laughed she said, "People put TVs everywhere now. Even in kitchens, like they afraid their own thoughts will find them." She asked me, then, what it felt like when people said my name with respect. "Like an invoice paid," I said without thinking. And we both laughed at the ugliness of the truth. She stepped closer to me, as if drawn by the noise we'd made together. And I realized suddenly how tall she was. How straight her back stayed even after a day bent over baseboards. I smelled the cleaner on her skin, bright and false. And under it something like toasted sugar I couldn't place until much later. When I would find the jar of coconut oil under our sink and unscrew the lid just to fill my head with it like a fool. "If I wore it," she said quietly. The words brittle with the effort to sound joking, "would it pinch?" The meaning slid over the surface of my mind and then sank. I surprised myself by not pretending to misunderstand. "It might," I said. She lifted the corner of her mouth. "Sometimes a little pinch makes you stand taller." For a moment the house felt like a stage again, the hush not lonely now but anticipatory. The curtain trembling because someone in the wings was breathing too hard. I set my palm on the mantel because I needed to anchor a part of me to wood. Ivy reached up and, with a quickness that made me think of a sparrow's change of direction, set her hand flat over mine. I didn't move. That was the first moment I could not, even to myself, call harmless. The contact was ordinary in the evidence and incriminating in the record. Neither of us looked at the other's hand. We looked at the portrait of my grandfather, needle between his teeth. And I felt something from my life's center wheel half a click in a new direction. A movement that didn't look like much but in a machine can mean the difference between ignition and a stalled engine. When she took her hand away, I felt not relief but a lightness that shadowed my next 10 breaths. After she left that day, I stood in the library until the light drained and the mantle's wood cooled, and I imagined the many ways one life could hook itself into another and lift disastrously, both. At dusk I drove to the strip mall and sat in my car without turning off the engine. The air conditioner wheezed. A boy at the bus stop wore shoes that lit up when he stamped his heels just so on the concrete. He stamped them again and again and again, as if testing whether light was still available to him on command. I envied him his proof. That night Margaret's sleep was noisy and, in the intervals, she asked small practical questions that made me feel like a liar even when I answered honestly. Did I return the casserole dish to Ruth? Did I refill the ice tray? Did I move the pot of rosemary into the sun? I said yes to all of it, and only the rosemary made me pause because I'd forgotten it existed. Afterwards I went out in my slippers and dragged the pot 3 feet to the right as if the adjustment would absolve me. Under the moon, the rosemary's smell climbed into my nose and refused to exit, an ancient sharpness. And I found myself whispering my last name into the leaves like a man checking whether his key still turned in the front door. In the morning I stood in the mirror and said it once aloud. Not to myself but as if offering it. And in that plain white room the syllables sounded heavier than they had the day before. As if they knew they were about to be asked to do work outside their job description. I am not a man who believes in omens, but I am a man who makes patterns out of repetition. And I noticed that week how often new envelopes came with my name printed on their bellies. How the mailman's footfalls sounded like an impatient metronome on the porch. How the politest way to undo a life is to start by repeating the parts of it that no one considers remarkable until they go missing. When the next package arrived, I was in the back room looking for a flashlight I hadn't used in years. I heard the bell, heard Ivy's steps, heard my name, heard the pen scrape. And I stood there in the little utility room among dried-out batteries and a box of curtain hooks and felt something like a stain spreading under water. If this is the point at which you want me to throw up my hands and declare the whole mess preordained, you'll be disappointed. I saw myself clearly. I saw the path's first stone and I set my foot on it, and when it held my weight I tried another. The fact that nothing cracked under me became proof that stepping was sane. And yet the instant I saw the slant of her signature, wrong, pretty, dangerous, I thought of Margaret's maiden name and how it had sat in a drawer for 42 years trapped under a stack of warranties and graduation programs, unused, stubborn. I thought of the way a name can become a storage unit full of boxes nobody opens because the key got misplaced or because the lock rusted and everyone was afraid what dust looks like when it's been left alone too long. That night I dreamed I was standing in a flood and the water only rose to my knees no matter how long I stood there, and I woke smiling. As if the world were merciful, and then the smile slid from my face when I realized I'd been grinning not at salvation but at the idea that I could be submerged and still have my pockets dry enough for someone else to slide her hands into them and take what she liked. On Mondays the house smelled of lemon and steam. And I began to wait for that smell the way a dog waits for a familiar car in the driveway. Margaret thought Ivy came for her, to keep things decent, she said. So Ruth doesn't gossip about dust on the blinds, but really Ivy came for the house. And the house came alive for me only when she was inside it. I noticed details I shouldn't have. The way her sneakers scuffed a heartbeat against the tile when she turned a corner too fast. The loose thread that clung stubbornly to her t-shirt hem. The little humming phrases she never seemed to finish. I caught myself timing errands to collide with her hours. Slipping home from the firm at 2 instead of 4. Inventing excuses about misplaced contracts or forgotten pens. Margaret barely noticed, lost in her shows and her naps. Once, when I carried a tray to her, she squinted at me and asked why I looked winded. I lied and said the stairs were harder these days. The truth was I'd stopped at the library doorway and watched Ivy stretch on tiptoe to shelve a book she'd borrowed for her son, the hem of her shirt lifting. A strip of skin showing pale against the dust-dark wood. She turned, caught me, didn't blush or stammer. Instead she said, "These books smell like my school in Juarez." And I found myself ashamed for wanting to press closer just to test if her skin smelled the same. The shame passed faster than it should have. A week later I came home to find her at the door signing for a package in my name. She held the pen steady, wrote each letter with a flourish that was not mine. And when she set the clipboard down she met my eyes without apology. "He didn't ask," she said. "Only wanted a name." She left the box on the counter. And I stood staring at it like it might contain a verdict. That night, Margaret rang her little bell for water and when I brought it she smirked and said, "You look guilty." I nearly confessed something. What, I don't know, but instead I said, I bought books, and watched her roll her eyes at my harmlessness. Later, alone in the dark, I whispered my own last name into the ceiling fan's churn just to see how it sounded when no one else claimed it.